What I'm going to talk today, I'm going to call it the Krugman challenge. Paul Krugman, when he came to Cambridge some years ago, because there was a new edition of Keynes' general theory, and he wrote an introduction to that edition of the general theory. And then he came to Cambridge, and he, in his exposition, he said that, talking about what Keynes had contributed at his time, he said that he saw today, as in the 1930s, there were the problems that they had. He said that the two key challenges for economic theory today, they were first to understand the increase in inequality in advanced countries and the underperformance of Latin America, the region from where I come from. Now, in a way, what I'm going to talk today is I'm trying to answering Krugman challenges, but in a bit larger context, because although he's completely right that if you look at today's world economy, two of the key issues that they are there is the massive increase in market inequality, and we're going to see the data in a minute, the massive increase in market inequality among OECD countries. And on the other hand, the remarkable underperformance of Latin America. I am going to say two things. One, I will add a third challenge to Krugman, because the underperformance is not only about Latin America. What we're going to see today is that the underperformance is in the whole West, in the North and in the South. Basically, productivity growth has collapsed both in advanced Western economies and in Latin America. So the underperformance is of the whole West, and on the other hand, of course, the increase in market inequality of the advanced Western economies. And basically, what I'm going to argue is that those two phenomena, the increase in inequality and the underperformance, are very much part of the same coin, a very toxic coin, but they are very much interrelated. So what I'm going to talk today is basically about that, the Krugman challenge, but adding the underperformance of the North, the Western North, to the challenge, and trying to answer that the two are very much part of the same phenomena, a different aspect of the same phenomenon. Let me give you just one example. If today in the United States, the share of the top 1%, the share of income share of the top 1%, was what it was when Reagan was elected, that top 1% would earn $2 trillion less than what they do. Basically, they earn a bit over 4 trillion, but if the share of income had remained stable, meaning if growth had been equally distributed since 1980, that top 1% will only make roughly $2 trillion. I'm talking in very round numbers, okay? So on the one hand, that top 1% is making $2 trillion more than otherwise if growth had been equally distributed. But the other side of the same coin is that if the investment share in the United States today was what it was when Reagan was elected in 1980, investment in the US, it would be 1 trillion above what it is now. So the crucial issue is how these two things happen and how they are interrelated. Meaning, just to put the numbers in context. Today, the top 1% in the United States earns extra, thanks to inequality, an amount which is equal to the entire GDP of Korea, year after year. But at the same time, in the United States, investment, because the investment rate has come down from 1980 until today in the way it has, investment in the United States is low by an amount which is similar to the entire GDP of Sweden and Norway put together. So what I will call this toxic coin, which I'm going to associate with the process of rentier capitalism, which we are witness today, it has reached to that extent that, as I said, in the United States, the top 1% earn an extra Korea, but investment is below an extra Sweden and Norway. And of course, productivity growth has come down in the way it has, and it has basically collapsed since the global crisis in 2008. In Europe, as you know, productivity has been actually stagnant since 2008, and in the United States, productivity growth has been only equal to 0.9%. So this, in a way, is the real puzzle. What I call this neoliberal inequality investment asymmetry in Western economies, which happens, as I said, in advanced Western economies and in the South, in Latin America, is a real puzzle. How did it come about? But also why the two things are connected, and the end result is the collapse of productivity growth. We're going to see all the numbers in a minute. And also, as you obviously know, this imbalance, it has been as toxic for productivity growth as it has for our democracy. I mean, I don't need to remind you about all these radical populist experiments that are taking place throughout the Western world, and well, in Britain, Brexit will be one obvious example. However, my point, and this is my main point today, is that this puzzle, such an increase in inequality, coupled with the collapse in investment and productivity growth, if one look at it from a Ricardian perspective, there is not much of a mystery. It is what you would expect if these things move in that direction. So my main point is that if you look at this, there are many perspectives. I mean, the reality is there, the numbers are there. The problem is that how you put the story together. And from several perspectives, like from a neoclassical perspective, it is a real puzzle, as Krugman was explaining in Cambridge a few years ago. However, what I will argue, and what I've been working recently, is that if you look at it from a Ricardian perspective, and I will explain in a minute what that means, well, from the perspective of Ricardo's economics, that puzzle, it will not be such a mystery after all. From a Ricardian perspective, this increase in market inequality in the advanced West and the underperformance are two sides of the same rentierization coin. It's basically about how we have constructed a world in which is a rentier's paradise, meaning one that is full of what I'm going to call easy rent. Easy rent in the sense that they're easy to acquire and they're easy to spend. And in my part of the world, in Latin America, that inequality investment rentier imbalance is a local tradition. I mean, that is what has been characterized in Latin American economic growth and economic development for a long time. What is new is also happening now in the Western North, in the United States and in Western Europe, and to a certain extent in Japan, but that is a more complex issue that we will discuss now. Now, when I say that in the US, had the income inequality remained stable since 1980, the top 1% will earn a whole Korea less than what they do, and that investment will probably be also stable, and the investment in the US would be a whole Sweden and Norway up. That is not such a exotic counterfactual. This is exactly what happened between 1950 and 1980. If you look at the US economy between 1950 and 1980, you find basically two stylized facts. One is that growth was equally distributed, meaning if you look at all the and this is a wonderful work, empirical work of Saez and Krugman, which are of the Piketty group, and they are at Berkeley. What they demonstrate is that between 1948 and 1980, growth in the US was remarkably equally distributed. Every percentile in the US, every different part of the distribution, they got exactly the same annual rate of growth of income, which was roughly 2%, except for the top 1%, which had a rate of growth was actually below 2%. But other than the top 1%, which actually got less than the rest, everybody else shared quite equally in that growth of national income, and the rate of investment was much higher, as I said, much higher than it was now, and productivity growth between 1950 and 1980 was about 2.5% per year, as opposed to 1980 until today, which is less than half of that, with the collapse after 2008. In other words, the counterfactual which I'm using is that, well, this is what actually happened between 1950 and 1980. If that had continued the same, as I said, the top 1% will earn a Korea less than what they do, and on the other hand, investment more likely will be a Sweden and Norway extra of what it is today. And productivity growth will obviously, not surprisingly, be, it's one would expect would also be much higher than what it is today. Now, let's look at some figures. I would like to call this inequality investment imbalance, which I've been explaining, for me is basically a distributed failure. In the US, if we look at non-residential investment as a proportion of the share of the top 1%, so you have the share of the top 1% and what is the relationship with the level of non-residential investment in the US. You can see that from the end of the war until 1980, the ratio was increasing quite rapidly from about 60%, meaning non-residential investment was roughly 60% of what the top 1% did, up to a point which was actually above 100%, meaning non-residential investment was growing so much faster than the share of the top 1% in national income, that the proportion of non-residential investment in that top 1% grew, it basically doubled from 60% to 120%. And this is within the period that the Washington Consensus liked to label the period of financial repression, so-called repression. Now, we see what happened afterwards. When we have these neoliberal economic reforms that came after 1980, one of the crucial characteristics was, as I said before, it appeared this inequality investment imbalance to such an extent that the share of non-residential investment as a proportion of the top 1%, it fell from 120% to a bit over 40%, about 45%. In other words, there was a massive collapse of the relationship between investment and inequality, the imbalance I'm talking about. But this, it gives you a bit the feel of the dimension of the contrast between what was going before and what was happened after 1980. Now, I use non-residential investment in this example because, as you know, non-residential investment is the one that creates productive capacities. Residential investment may be very good for many things, but it doesn't generate productive capacities. Now, looking at the same example, but now in a more general sense, the whole of private investment as a proportion of the income share of the top 10%, we can see the same phenomenon from the end of the war to when Reagan was elected. There was an increase of the share of private investment and the share of the top 10%, meaning private investment was growing faster than the top 10%, and therefore the whole of private investment, having been only 40% of the share of the top 10%, it became a bit over half. And what happened in the period before? There was this collapse, and today is about 27, 28%. Now, the other point I'm going to make is that what we see in the advanced Western world, both in the US and in Europe, is what I like to call a process of reverse catching up. Now, remember that one of the main hypotheses of the Washington Consensus was that if you did all the economic reforms that the Washington Consensus was offering, there will be a process of catching up of lower income countries, let's say Latin America, middle income countries. There will be a process of catching up with the productive frontier, meaning, and this very much neoclassical economic growth, is that as growth decelerates when it gets to the frontier, countries which are low income or middle income will be able to grow faster than the countries which are at the frontier, and there will be a process of catching up. And the catching up will not only be in terms of income per capita, the catching up will also be in institutions. I mean, labor markets in Latin America will kind of Europeize and will become more similar to those in Europe. Inequality in Latin America will tend to become more similar to those in the US and in Europe. That's the normal idea of the process of catching up of neoclassical economics of the of the Washington Consensus. And one of the key ideas of the debate in the 1960s and 70s of the Washington Consensus was this idea of catching up. I'm sure those of you who are doing economics and have done classical growth theory knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, what we find since 1980, which is quite remarkable in the Western world, in the case of the United States clearly, is that it is the United States that has Latino-Americanized instead of Latin America, who has Europeized or become more similar to countries closer to the production frontier. The United States today, the relationship between investment and inequality is very much the one you find in Mexico, in Brazil, Argentina, and the rest of the Latin American countries. Now, this is quite surprising because it's, in a way, exactly the opposite of what was suggested. And this is part of what we are discussing today. And when you look, as we will see in a minute, all this from a Ricardian perspective, this will probably be not such a mystery as it is today, because surely it is a puzzle why the catching up has actually taken place in the other way around, in the opposite way than it was expected. And you can see that today the US is very much in most of its macroeconomic indicators, as the one I have indicated, is very much similar to those in Latin America. In fact, its market inequality is more unequal now than that of Mexico, and its level of private investment is not that different from those of Latin America. Now, this phenomenon of the inequality investment asymmetry, you find it in the whole of Europe. It's not just a phenomenon of the US, this extra Korea minus Sweden and Norway, the inequality investment imbalance, but you find it in the whole of Western world. For example, I have chosen here a few of the European countries and show how the increase of in all of them, there is a significant increase in the share of the top 1%, and here I'm using the Piketty data, meaning is those that come from tax returns. And we find that in all of the Western European countries, there is a large sample of them. In Denmark, the increase in the share of the top 20, if you compare 1950-80 with 1980 to 2019, and I don't have to explain the detail of how I did the calculation, but basically it's all come from the Piketty website, data bank. You can see that the inequality, the share of the top 1% has increased in all of these countries. And on the other hand, in all of them, you have a decrease in the investment rate, investment as a share of GDP of quite significant numbers. In other words, the inequality investment asymmetry that we find after 1980 in advanced Western economies, which did not happen in the period 1980, is something which is quite generalized. It's not only the case of the US, which could be probably is the most transparent of them all, but it's also happened in most of the Western world. So the key point is that what we have done in the advanced West is that we have built basically what I call a rentier paradise. One which is, as I will explain why, is full of easy rents. And what I mean by easy rent is that are rents which are easy to acquire and easy to spend. And if you look at that from a Ricardian perspective, it makes quite a lot of sense. Now, this asymmetry is also found in Japan, as I already told you. The share of the top 1% has increased by 4.2 percentage points, and the share of investment in GDP has fallen by a 6.9 percentage point. By the way, all these data are percentage point, okay, are not percents, are percentage point. And often when I discuss this issue, people tell me, well, but what about China? I mean, China has also had a massive increase in inequality, but it has not affected its investment rate. What is so peculiar about China that it has bucked the trend, in the sense that it had, as opposed to Korea and Taiwan and other emerging Asian countries, as we will see, in which the inequality investment asymmetry is the other way around. They have low level of inequality with high level of investment. But China, and in a way India, but mostly China, is a country that has bucked the trend, in the sense that you have an increase in inequality with an increase in investment rate. And in the case of China, it's not such a mystery, because
public enterprises at many points in time during this period since 1980, they have account for nearly 80% of investment in China. So obviously, when you have the public sector meddling in the way that it does in China, obviously this relationship it could be different, because obviously the role of public enterprise in the case of investment is quite substantial in China. As I said, there are periods in which up to 80% of investment in China has been accounted by public enterprise. So in a way, China is not so much the exception that confirms the rule, but it's a different ball game altogether. It's a different story. The story of the investment, inequality investment asymmetry is basically one of laissez-faire economies, deregulated economies, both in finance and in the real sector, and subsidiary states. Basically, what has happened in the world economy since the neoliberal economic reform of 1980. Now, the impact of that, as I told you, in productivity growth, it's quite remarkable. If you look at Western Europe and Latin America, the key issue is that in both of them, there is a quite remarkable collapse of GDP growth. In Western Europe, from 4.4 between 50 and 80 to just 2.2 between 80 and the 2008 financial crisis, and then only 0.9. But if you look at that between the two components, employment and productivity, you can see that the collapse of GDP is entirely due to the collapse of productivity growth. Productivity growth that was growing at 3.5% between 50 and 80, it came down to 1.6 between 80 and 2008, and then 0.4, as I already mentioned, after that. While employment has remained relatively, the growth of employment has remained relatively constant, it is productivity growth that has collapsed after 1980, and particularly after 2008. In the case of Latin America, it's even more remarkable, because then the GDP that was growing at 6% per year in the period 50-80, it came down to just 2.3%. But if you look at employment rate, it has remained completely fairly stable. So the whole of the collapse of GDP growth is the collapse of productivity growth, which fell from 3.1% to literally complete stagnation for the last 4 decades on average. Of course, there are sectoral variation and country variation, but when you take the average of all sectors and the average of all countries, productivity growth has been stagnant ever since. So the underperformance of Western Europe and Latin America, coming back to Krugman, is entirely a productivity growth phenomenon. It's not, obviously, I mean, it does not affect employment in any way. So it's entirely the issue that we have to explain is why productivity growth has collapsed in the way it has. And my point is that I associate this very much with the inequality investment asymmetry, which I've been explaining so far. For example, if you look at one editorial of the Financial Times, referring to the underperformance of Western Europe, is basically, it tells you that how Europe, and in this case Germany, has been, I mean, how China has turned the tables on Western Europe. Germany once saw China as an export market for machinery with which China will develop its industrial base. Today, China is becoming the senior partner in the relationship. Because the biggest problem of Europe is that it's falling behind in the technological race. With those level of investment, probably is not much of a surprise. And this is symptomatic of it's not just a German problem, of European problem. And today the complacency is turning into panic.
So if we look at another, the different regions and main countries in the world, and we make a ranking in terms of productivity growth, what we find is that in the period of 50-80, Europe and Latin America were, relatively to the other regions and countries in the world, were performing rather well. But in the second period, 1980-2019, Europe is almost one of the last, and Latin America is the very last. So this is to reinforce the fact that this is mostly a Western phenomenon. This underperformance in terms of productivity growth is entirely a Western phenomenon, as well as the relationship between inequality and investment. As I told you, China is different, but also I will mention the other countries in emerging Asia we'll see are also different. So this is mostly a Western phenomenon, north and south of the equator. The fact that productivity growth has collapsed to such an extent that they have gone from the top of the ranking to very much at the bottom of the ranking in the second period. Now, this is a complicated issue because, as Keynes emphasized in several of his works, here I quote The Economic Consequences of Peace, he emphasized that capitalism would only become legitimate as a system if the elite used the share of national income productively. He gave the example of he was talking about the end of the 19th century, and he gave the example of the emerging countries of the time, which was Germany and the US, compared with the more mature economies of the time, which was the case of Britain. In his own words, when he explained the contrast between Germany and the US, the emerging economies of the time, versus mature Britain during the third technological revolution, the one that took place at the end of the 19th century, in his own word, he says the new rich from Germany and the US preferred to the power that investment gave them to the pleasure of immediate consumption. Herein lay, in fact, the main justification of the capitalist system. If the rich had spent their wealth on their own enjoyment, the world would long ago have found such a regime intolerable. Intolerable indeed. And this is basically what we are having today. We're having a system that is rapidly losing completely its legitimacy because obviously the way that the elite is not only increasing the share of national income, but the way that it wasting the resources that they are getting at the time. This, as I said, this is clearly the fading legitimacy, which is very much part of the politics of today. And this is also affects the other groups, affects the social democracy, which has not been able to offer so far a proper alternative to that. And this is very much, in my point of view, is connected to the rise of radical populism in the US and in Europe and certainly Latin America with Bolsonaro and so on. It's a long story. I don't have the time to go into this very much, but I call that the Gramscian moment. Gramsci, when he was working at a different time, but not that different in what was happening, he says that there are periods in time where the old is fading, but the new failed to be born. Times in which the old system, the old ideologies, the old way of doing things are basically fading, but we haven't been able to come out with new ideas which have taken proper legitimacy and proper credibility in order to transform things. And what explained that is in the period in between those two,
when something fails, but the other fail to take on, is that when he discusses that a lot of the political nasty things tend to happen. And I will put very much the radical populist experiments that we are having at the moment in part of that interregnum between how one system is losing its legitimacy without we having been able to produce a credible alternative to that. And in that sense, well, time is running quickly, so I'll move to the next point. As I already mentioned, is that the point of Ricardo is that he was the first of the classical economists that took the issue of rents seriously. And he criticized from Smith to all the rest because he explained that they didn't understand the issue of rents. For those of you who had studied Ricardo, in his gross model, he clearly identified three agents: the rentier, in the model, the landlord; the capitalist, who is the actual person who works the land; and the workers, who are those who do the work. Those are the three factors of production, and his key contribution is to try to understand the relationship between rents and profit, between rentiers and capitalists. How the conflict between those two factors of production are very much part of the problem of capitalism. Rentiers is nothing new. Smith had basically defined rentier, those that love to rape where they never sown, and talking about the landlords. So in a way, it's not that the other classical economists did not recognize the issue of rents, but the whole idea of Smith, that goes all the way to Marx and all the way to the other classical economists, is that as capitalism will develop, rentiers will basically become very much like capitalists, and there will be basically two factors of production, capitalists and workers, and all the conflict between them will be very much part of the life of the whole system. Nevertheless, for Ricardo, what he emphasized is that rentiers will never disappear within capitalism. What will change in time, there will be cycles, will be the relationship between rentiers and capitalism, rent and profits. And this is what it basically puts him in a completely different theoretical perspective. And in his gross model, what he basically discusses, and of course I don't have time to go to the details of his gross model, but what he basically discusses that the inbuilt tendency of a market economy is that the rentiers will tend to take the upper hand. And what does it mean? It means that the share of income within capital, it will favor, in time, it will favor rents. Basically, rents will squeeze profits in the long term, and here are his assumptions and all the model, which I don't have time to explain, but in the steady state of his model, we will be in a position in which rents will tend to appropriate the whole surplus, and therefore capitalists will be denied of their profits. And since investment and productivity growth is a function of profits, what basically that will affect will very rapidly the level of profit and the level of productivity growth. So he was, as opposed to Smith and Marx and the other classical economists,
he was rather pessimistic in terms of the future of capitalism, in the sense that its natural inbuilt tendency was that rentiers will take the upper hand and rents will tend to grow vis-a-vis profits, and they will tend to appropriate the whole surplus. And then he explained that how technological progress and international trade will be the two factors that will save capitalism. Basically, what will re-energize profits will be technological progress and international trade. And he explained how, provided that there is a continuous process of technological progress and a continuous process of enlargement of international trade, capitalism will be perfectly able to continue to deliver rate of growth of productivity growth, because technological progress and international trade will be able to solve that conflict within capital, between rents and profit, and will be able to provide enough for both and for productivity growth to continue. So in a way, what is new now, and this is the real puzzle, what is new today is that we're having this collapse of productivity growth and the inequality investment imbalance, even though technological progress and international trade are both taking place, and quite in a significant way. I mean, you know perfectly well the massive process of technological change that have taken place during this period with the fifth technological revolution. Well, you use it rather continuously all day. And on the other hand, well, globalization had produced quite an increase in international trade. So what is new today is that, as opposed to the example of Ricardo at the time when he was working at the beginning of the 19th century, today we have this process of rents taking over within capital, and the inequality investment imbalance and the collapse of productivity growth, even though we have a rapid process of technological progress and a rapid progress of international trade. This is the real issue here. It's not so much that if you allow things to continue in a way that they done, this process will take place as in the Ricardo model, and we will move toward a steady state in which rents will tend to appropriate the whole surplus, investment and productivity growth, as well as profit, will collapse, and therefore we will get to some process of stagnation. The issue is that this is happening despite technological progress and international trade. So what I try to explain in this paper is why this is happening, not only in general terms, but why it happened at the time of technological progress on international trade. Now let's look at this issue, that what the issue of why we have built today in the West this, what I call this rentier paradise, full of easy rents which are easy to acquire and easy to spend. The easy to acquire, again, the US is the most transparent of them all. If you look at the share of the top 10% on national income, the black line, and if you look at the value, the stock of financial assets, the value of the stock of financial asset, which is the blue line, and is measured as multiples of GDP, you would see that since economic reform, which financial liberalization started in the 70s, you can see that there is a remarkable process of co-integration between the movement of the inequality and the process of financialization that we have set in motion, which is characterized by this explosion of the value of financial assets. Meaning rents, in this case rents from finance, are very much part of this rocketing of inequality and rocketing of the share of the top, the top 10% owns 2/3 of shares. It's not surprising that this explosion of the process of
the value of financial assets during this period has been associated with the growing process of inequality. And you can see that how the two have moved very much in motion. A is the 2008 financial crisis, and this basically has continued after that. So the issue of rents, the issue of having transformed our economies into some sort of financial paradise is that, as I said, there's two facets of the phenomenon. One is that this new type of rents are quite easy to acquire. I mean, financialization could not be more clearly, but they're also easy to spend. Why they're easy to spend? Because, as you can see, this massive increase in the share of the top 10% in the US had been associated with this decline of private investment as a share of GDP. And what is the key difference between rents and profits? Why rentiers are such a different animal than capitalists? Why those who live from the returns on their rents are so much different than those who live from their profit? And the issue is that the key characteristic of a market economy is that capitalists that works in competitive market, they have the compulsion to invest. I mean, in a market economy, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland. You have to run to stay still. Basically, if you work in market economies, and as capitalists have to do, you have no choice but to invest. You cannot stand still, because if you stay still, obviously markets will basically you become uncompetitive and you will not be able to survive in markets. The problem is that markets don't have any compulsion for rentiers to invest their rent, because their rents do not depend on market mechanism in the way that profits of capitalists depend on market mechanism. The key difference between rentier and capitalist is not so much in what they do. The difference is that in what they have to do with their earnings. While capitalists have no option but to invest a large proportion of those resources they get in terms of profit, and this is Ricardo's point, the key characteristic of rentier is that neither the invisible hand or any other factor within the markets will create the compulsions for those rent to be invested. So economies where the share of capital is basically being biased towards rent is one that you will find this low level of investment, while when the same share of capital is biased toward profit, you will find that for the same share of capital as a whole, you will find much more higher level of capitalism. Basically, the difference between 1950 and 80 is that the Bretton Woods framework, the scenario that was built from Bretton Woods onward, the whole post-war development process from 1950 and 80, was one in which all the regulation and all the economic scenario that was built was one that was basically benefit profits and try to constrain rents. While by the process of financial liberalization and market liberalization and the subsidiary role of the state and the way that we have moved since, it had produced the opposite scenario, one in which within capital, rentiers are the ones that are taking the upper hand and the ones that are basically biasing the proportion of capital that goes to rents and goes to profit very much toward rents. And the result is that what I call following Ricardo, that rent are easy to spend,
is that because they don't have the compulsion to be invested. So you have today this remarkable increase in market inequality, the increase in the share of the top 1% and the share of the top 10%. But if you look at what follows from there in terms of private investment, is quite a remarkable decline, not only in most countries as a share of GDP, but in the case of the US is one that has taken place in a much more profound way. So as I said, Ricardo was quite right in that sense, that when you create a rentier's paradise, you should not be surprised that there will be a tendency towards increasing inequality on one side, but also to a decline in investment rate and productivity growth on the other. Now, he was quite optimistic that technological change and international trade, as I said, will basically solve that problem. But what we have moved today is a situation in which we have gone to such an extreme that we find that the huge corporations that have taken over the new technological paradigm, think of Google, Amazon, Uber, and all the rest, they have become rentier corporations, and they have basically not allowed this new technological paradigm to have produced the boost in productivity growth as it was as it basically was expected. Now, because time is running out, let me move to the inequality side and try to explain a little bit more that side. If you look at Germany, I already mentioned that an example. What will happen in terms, the blue line is market inequality in Germany. Unfortunately, the data bank on market inequality is they produce only Gini, they don't give information on deciles, so we can look, it's difficult to look within the market inequality, what is happening as we have been seeing before. So let's move on to work with the Gini, which, as you know, is an index of inequality for the whole of the population. Now, you can see that what has happened since the beginning of economic reforms in Germany has been a massive process of increase of market inequality, which I have already mentioned, to the point that, again, it has reached to Latin American levels. This point here is the average market inequality in Latin America. And you can see that while most Latin American countries have had started the period, as everybody knows, with very high market inequality, they have basically continued to have the same high level of market inequality, except that inequality, because of reforms, was basically able to be associated with the collapse of investment and productivity growth. But we're back to the process of reverse catching up. Basically, in inequality, it's not that Latin America is becoming as is Europe, but is Europe or the US becoming as Latin America, and Mexico and US being more unequal, market unequal than Mexico, and most European countries are more market unequal than even Latin America today. And again, well, what has Germany to show for this remarkable increase in market inequality? If you look at market inequality, the blue line, again, the same as before, with investment as a share of GDP, look how investment as a share of GDP, you have the scissor effect, how market inequality has come hand by hand with the complete collapse of investment as a share of GDP, which used to be close to 30% of GDP, and today is basically similar to 20%. And surprise, surprise, that is very much the level that Latin America
has had during this whole period. And in terms of productivity growth, the same. We have this massive increase in market inequality, the one we have been seeing so far, with the collapse of productivity growth in the way that has taken place in Germany and the rest of the Western world. Productivity growth that was growing at roughly 4% in the period at the end of the period 1950-1980, it fell from roughly 4.5% today to close to zero, very much like the Latin American process of productivity growth. So all what I've been trying to decipher today, trying to discuss today, is this scissors effect. Why is it that what we have had from 1980 until today has been very much this process of inequality investment imbalance or asymmetry, and therefore inequality productivity growth asymmetry? Why these two things come together? And the only way at least the only way I can understand it, is to go back to some form of Ricardian analysis and try to understand the role of rentiers in the process of financialization, but also in the process of production. This basically rentier paradise that we had been building in the West. Now, those of you who knows this literature will know that there is a lot of debate and there is a lot of economists that try to argue that this increase of market inequality in Germany was somehow inevitable. It was characteristic of the new technological paradigm, is almost inevitable in the process of globalization. Basically, going back to Mrs. Thatcher, there was no alternative. Basically, that although you may or may not like it, somehow it's a sort of that process of increasing market inequality was a bit like the law of gravity, that basically you have to follow it. And what Germany did, which is very much part of what most of European countries have done in the sort of social democratic solution for that, was to let the market inequality increase in the way it has, but also increase massively social security. If before economic reforms, for Germany to have a disposable income inequality, meaning after taxes and transference, market inequality is the one that comes out of economic activity, and then comes taxes and transference that obviously try, in these cases, improve inequality, and we end up with the disposable income inequality, which is the inequality after taxes and transference. So if before economic reform, Germany had to improve the market Gini by 28% to get to a disposable Gini of roughly 30, today we find that despite this massive increase in market inequality, disposable income inequality has remained roughly the same, and about 30%, which means that the improvement of the Gini, market Gini, has had to go up from 28 to 43, meaning the expenditure, the social security expenditure. Now, those of you may know, but some of you may come as a surprise, that Germany today, and this is the same for most of Western Europe, uses 16% of GDP in social security. And if you add free education and free health, you get to 25% of GDP. Meaning today in Germany, 1 of every 4 euros of value added has to be used to reverse this remarkable increase in market inequality since the late 70s, 1980s. Now, if one thinks, as I do, that this increase in market inequality was very much artificially generated and pretty much avoidable. So you will see that the increase in social expenditure that has to be followed in order to make this politically acceptable and therefore to sustain disposable inequality relatively stable despite the increase in market inequality, that led to a situation which is basically completely unsustainable. I mean, how long Western European countries will continue to be able to spend 25% of GDP in order to reverse the increase in market inequality that has taken place this period? It will come as no surprise if I tell you that public debts in the whole of the Western Europe has already gone well beyond 100% of GDP. Now, what Korea shows is that there was nothing inevitable about what was happening in Western Europe and in the US. There was a perfectly viable alternative. You could live with this technological paradigm. You could live with this process of globalization. You could live with this process of financialization of the world economy. You will live in the same world, but without a massive increase in your market inequality. You can see that market inequality in Korea has been remarkably similar. So basically, Korea can reach the same destination as Germany in disposable income inequality, meaning inequality after taxes and transference, but with very little effort and in terms of redistribution. Basically, having to use a very small proportion of its GDP in order. I finish in 2 minutes. I have only one graph to go. And this contrast between Germany and Korea, between Western Europe and some of the emerging Asian countries, shows very clearly that whatever happens in Western Europe and in the US was not unavoidable, was a choice. We live in a world of multiple equilibrium. Western Europe and the US choose one route, and Korea continue in another one, even though they both live in the same globalized world, in the same financialized world, in the same world of in the new technological paradigm and so on. Well, it will come as no surprise that investment rate in Korea is much higher than that of Western Europe. Productivity growth in Korea is much higher than in Western Europe, meaning that low level of inequality has come with the opposite package than in Western Europe, which is high level of investment and productivity growth. And I finish here, which is, the point is that if you compare Latin America with Western Europe, you find, as we know, as I already said, that market inequality in both of them is now very similar. It used to be very different, but now it's very similar. What is really different is the disposable income inequality. Now, you will be forgiven that in Latin America and probably in what most of you think, is that, well, the solution is to do what Western Europe does, which is basically through taxes and transference to increase your redistributed effort in order to be able to deliver a more civilized level of inequality in terms of disposable income, the final inequality after taxes and transference. However, there is this other alternative, the one I was showing, those of Korea and Taiwan. Brazil, if it wants to improve its disposable income equality, it has two choices. One, to follow the European route and spend 25% of GDP in order to try to solve a perfectly self-made problem, or it can develop productive strategies, a bit like the post-war Keynesian productive strategy of Europe and the US between 1950 and 1980. Think of different productive strategies where you can mix low level of market inequality with high level of investment and productivity growth, as Europe and the US used to do between 1950, and now very few countries are still trying to do. So, as I said, when we go back to Krugman challenges, why this increase in market inequality in advanced Western Europe, and why is associated with such a underperformance? I think that from a Ricardian perspective, you can answer that challenge. If you have a movement within capital from profit to rents, and from, in terms of rentiers beginning to take the upper hand and squeezing capitalism and profits from the economy, you will not be surprised if that leads to a massive increase in market inequality associated with a low level of investment and of productivity growth, which is basically what has characterized the West since the economic reforms. And what shows Korea, Taiwan, and other countries is that obviously there is a choice, but a choice that obviously needs to be re-engineered in order to deliver a low market inequality in the market, which is basically giving back the upper hand to capitalists and profits, and therefore investment and productivity growth, and that could be associated with a much lower market inequality, higher level of investment and productivity growth. Anyway, I'm sorry I took a bit more time. It's a big issue. I wish I could have explained other things, but I think that time has, I have gone over time even more than I should have. Thank you very much, and back to you.